Check, check, check. Check 1, 2, check 1, 2, check 1, 2. Hey everybody, we'll get started here in just a couple minutes, kind of waiting on everybody here in class to get back from a little break. So give me just 2 or 3 minutes maybe, and we'll get started. All right, we will go ahead and get started. So, welcome. Good to see y'all. We are hopefully going to get through Habakkuk and Joel this evening, and we'll get into Habakkuk pretty well. Joel, we're just going to do a little bit more of an overview, even though there's so many good things in Joel. I would like to have a little bit of time at the end of class today to talk about the what did I call it in here? The writing assignment. So that's still a few weeks away from when it's due, but just to talk about it a little bit and see if there's any questions about it. We do have spring break next week, so no class next week. I know you wouldn't be here anyways, since you've come all at once, twice. The camera's not on you. They don't know who I'm talking about. What? No. Let's pray and we'll get started. God, we're so thankful for you this evening. We're thankful for the opportunity to be together. We're thankful for people like Habakkuk who get involved in the lives, who get involved in our lives, who are empathetic to things that are going on, and who come to you on behalf of themselves and on behalf of us. I pray, God, that you help us to be Habakkuk's in our lives, to be people who intercede, who go between, who bring people to you and bring you to people. Help us as we get into your word tonight, and just help us to see you more clearly than we did when we came in. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen. All right, so Habakkuk. Anybody read Habakkuk recently? Yes? No? Maybe so? Even if you haven't read it recently, what stands out about Habakkuk that's different from other prophets that we've been reading, and any other prophet, really? Anything that stands out? So, yep. A lot of hurt. A lot of injustice, definitely. Habakkuk, good portion of his oracles that are recorded here, he's complaining. He's complaining to God. And it's written very differently. Most of the other prophets are speaking on behalf of God to people. They're speaking on behalf of God, either to God's people or to Nineveh, to Israel, to Judah. Prophets are hearing from God and speaking on his behalf. But Habakkuk I'm sure he did that also, but that's not really what's recorded here about him. What's recorded here about him is that he had conversations with God on behalf of himself and on behalf of the people. So it's a very, very different kind of book than what we've been reading. We saw Amos do this just a little bit because God said, I'm going to do something in your days. And Amos said, whoa, wait. Do you really want to do that? And God relented until Amos saw how bad it really was. So Amos did that a little bit in chapter 7, but the whole book of Habakkuk is this conversation between God and Habakkuk, he doesn't convey a message from God to God's people. He conveys a message to God, one that he himself feels because he's part of God's people. The same thing that God says is going to come on everybody else is going to come on you too. So he's empathetic with his community of people, but more than that, he understands, like he's in the middle of it. He's in the middle of it. So he takes on a very different role of a prophet here. You really see this go-between kind of role. Yes, Kenva, he asks questions. He questions God. He does. He questions him in some ways, which you see in the Psalms a lot. You see in Lamentations a little bit with Jeremiah, who's experiencing what Habakkuk is actually talking with God about. So Habakkuk, he's having this conversation with God about Babylon coming in. And Lamentations is actually Jeremiah experiencing what Habakkuk is talking about. So this is a little bit before Jeremiah and Lamentations. But you can see that Habakkuk is really heart-wrenched about what's going to be coming their way. And then the very last chapter 3, is different than all of that even also, but he plays this intercessory role, intercedes on behalf of Judah, intercedes on behalf of God's people. So it's a very, very different kind of book. It's going to take place during the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, between about 609 and 600 BC. So this is Judah's, starting to be on its last legs a little bit. Them being not wiped out, but Babylon coming in is somewhat imminent at this point. But what's happening from 609 to 600 BC? So we talked last week about Assyria. They get wiped out by Babylon in about 612 BC. So Assyria basically wiped out Egypt. Assyria wiped out Israel. So if you think of our little map, remember our little map? I think I've got it over here still. So we have Judah down here, the southern kingdom. This is back during Amos's time when this is still all together. So Assyria has they came down from up here. They wiped out Syria. They wiped out Israel. So Assyria is on the border, the northern border of Judah, for a little while, right? So Judah gets pretty scared of Assyria. They become a vassal kingdom to Assyria. Well, then Babylon comes in, and Assyria was one of the greatest nations that the world had seen up to that point. They were a literal empire, and they seemed like this just massive, scary place. But then Babylon comes in with the help of the Medes, and they wipe out Assyria. They wipe out one of the greatest empires that the world had seen up to this point in time. So what do you think? So if Assyria was on the border of Judah, when Assyria gets wiped out by Babylon in 612, who's Judah afraid of now? Babylon, right? Let's take it to us for a minute. If this were us, let's say who would be the most feared country in the world to the United States? Who do we fear the most? Probably Russia, right? What if? So Russia, it's if you go around the world this direction, for you, Russia's not particularly far away from Alaska, right? If you go this way. So let's say Russia comes in, they wipe out Alaska, and then they take over Canada. And now, all of a sudden, Russia is not across the ocean from the United States. They share a land border, a very, very long land border with the United States. What's going to happen? What would happen if that happened? Things going to be cool and chill with Russia? Yeah, there's going to be some conflict. Like where there's already some conflict and there's already some fear and and we're not, this isn't like Cuban Missile Crisis kind of time. This isn't Cold War with Russia. This is now when things are down the road a little bit, but there's still that fear and that worry about Russia, and then all of a sudden they share your border. Conflict is going to happen. Things are going to escalate. Cold War is probably going to start. You can imagine how things would go if that were to happen. It probably would not go very well. Well, that's what's just happened with Judah. They have had this terrifying nation on their border, and now all of a sudden Babylon, an even more terrifying nation, because they wiped out the most terrifying nation that existed in the world at that point in time, or in their world at least. So that's what Judah's looking at. They're looking at Babylon being right on their border. So it's a scary time for them. Judah had a pact with Babylon, but during this period of time they went back on that pact with Babylon. So it's pretty scary for them. So Habakkuk, his main concern to start out with, it's not Babylon, but it's what's going on in his own nation. So you got Babylon on your doorstep, but then there's a whole bunch of stuff going on in Judah, inside of Judah, regardless of that. So chapter 1, verse 1, the oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw. O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear? Or cry to you violence, and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity, and why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me, strife and contention arise. I imagine most of us have had a similar feeling like that before when there's been stuff going on around us in our life. Why do you allow that to continue? How long am I going to have to deal with this? Psalm 13, David's crying out, how long, Lord? How long are you going to forget me forever? Revelation chapter 6, the saints, the ones who are beginning to be persecuted by Rome, they're crying out, how long, God? It's a common cry. And Habakkuk says the same thing. He says, how long am I going to have to cry for help? There is crazy stuff going on around me. Crazy, crazy stuff going on around me. So he's crying out, how long are you going to forget me forever? Verse 4, the law is paralyzed. Justice never goes forth. I wonder if he read Amos. Remember chapter 5 in Amos? Let justice roll. He says justice isn't rolling. It's not even going forth one little bit. For the wicked surround the righteous. So justice goes forth perverted. So it's there, but it's perverted, it's twisted, it's not right. Justice isn't right. And the wicked surround the righteous. So there's a few, it sounds like, in Judah who are doing right, who are trying to do things right with God and with their fellow people. But it's a righteous few, and they are absolutely surrounded by the wicked. This is not really that good of an example, but Jeremy, when you were almost in high, like 8th grade, 9th grade-ish, the youth group here at the church, we pick up, goodness, we were picking up 40 or 50 high schoolers every week in vans and buses. They come without parents. They just come on their own. And it sort of got to the point where it was just wild and crazy every single time we got together. And it was more just crowd control the whole time, as opposed to being able to encourage and do anything good with anybody. And within that group of 40 or 50, there was a small number of people who really were trying to do right and trying to do well and trying to learn and trying to be a part of this. I mean, there were a few who were trying to do it right, but what would happen is that they would be surrounded by all these people who just, I don't even know why they were there. I mean, maybe just because they had some food for the, I don't know. I don't know why people came, but they came. But it sure wasn't to learn anything about Jesus. Maybe there were some pretty girls. I don't know. Yeah. And what happened was that those few who were really trying to do it, they would just sort of become like everybody else, because they were so surrounded by people who were doing it different, their peers who were doing it different. And so we said, just briefly, for a little bit, we're not picking everybody else up. We're just picking up the few. And we stopped picking up 40 or 50 people, and we picked up about 7 or 8, and poured into those 7 or 8, and they got really strong, and then we started bringing other people back. And what happened was, now they instead of them sort of becoming like everybody else came, and there was this atmosphere already there, and everybody else became like them. And it was really, really cool. But it just stands out to me because wicked is not really the right term. That's the term that's used here. But it was this righteous few surrounded by people who just didn't care about anything that was going on. And that's sort of the situation here. You have this righteous few, and they're surrounded by an entire nation of people who are just they're not doing right. They're wicked. They're awful. They're terrible. They care nothing about God. They care nothing about people. And that's what Habakkuk finds himself in the middle of. He probably counts himself as some of these righteous few. But if you've ever been someplace where you felt like you were the only one, regardless of what the situation was, like you just felt totally out of place. That's what Habakkuk's saying here. He felt alone. He felt alone. So in the next section here, God answers. He responds. So Habakkuk's crying out to God, "How long? How long?" I mean, really, look at what's going on. And God answers in verses 5 through 11. And so this conversation begins between them. Chapter 1, verse 5, "Look among the nations and see, wonder and be astounded, for I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told." God says, it may not look like there's something going on, but Habakkuk, I'm at work. And at first, that's a very comforting thing, to know that God is at work, to know that He's working. Oh man, lost our stream. All right, well, I'm recording it, so we'll put it up later. Sorry, everybody. So God's at work. Oh, we're back. Hey, so I know we just dropped there for a minute. I am recording this, so if it continues to drop and continues to have problems, I will go ahead and post the recording, and the recording will be full. So just go ahead and count on me doing that. I'm not looks like the internet's moving slow tonight or something. So if it continues to do that, just know I'm going to post the recording. So He's at work, and at first that's a really encouraging thing. God's at work. That's an encouraging thing to know, right? And it's easy to forget. It's easy to forget when you look around and all you see is chaos and mess and evil. To remember that God is at work. So at first that's encouraging, but then chapter 1, verse 6, "For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans." That's another name for the Babylonians. Chaldeans, Babylon, same group of people. Behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are dreaded and fearsome. Their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. And he continues to describe them. And all of a sudden, this idea that God is at work isn't quite as comforting, because what God is bringing about is the Chaldeans are going to come in and wipe out Judah. The Babylonians are going to come in and wipe them out. He's going to use something even more evil to destroy the evil that is in Judah. Nebuchadnezzar was king in Babylon at this point. You'll recognize Nebuchadnezzar from what book? Daniel. Yep, which we'll get into when we come back from spring break. So Nebuchadnezzar, he came to power in about 605 BC, and he reigned until 562 BC. So he had a pretty long reign, and he was a fearsome dude. He was a fearsome dude. You did not mess with Nebuchadnezzar. They're dreaded and fearsome. Their justice and dignity will go forth from themselves. The type of justice that Babylon would issue is a very violent kind of justice. Verse 10, at kings they scoff, at rulers they laugh. I mean, they just come in and wiped out the greatest nation in the world, Assyria. They laugh at other rulers that might try to stand in their way. So God has a plan. He's at work, which seems encouraging, but then he reveals his plan to Habakkuk, and Habakkuk's he's not particularly excited about this plan. He's not very excited about it. So his response is what we get beginning in verse 12 of chapter 1. And it's at first, okay, that's great, you're doing something about it. And because it's you who is doing something about it, I know that you're not going to destroy everyone. Verse 12, are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, you have ordained them as a judgment, and you, O Rock, have established them for reproof. So Habakkuk's not very excited about this, but he says, at least it is you who are bringing this about. And I know, God, that you are not going to destroy Judah completely. And it's almost similar to, there's this weird story. It's told similarly in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. 2 Chronicles? 1 Chronicles? Don't quote me. One of the Chronicles about David, and he messes up, and he has a census. Y'all remember this story? David has it's a weird story because he has this census, which probably means that he's getting ready to go to war. There's only a couple reasons why you had a census back in the day, and one of the reasons was you wanted to know how many fighting men that you had, how many people could go out to war. So he's probably getting ready to go out to war, and God says, David, I told you not to do that, and you did it anyways. And because of that, there's going to be judgment come down on you and Israel. And so he gives some options about what could. He gives David 3 different options about what could happen, and he lets David choose the whatever he wants. And the one David chooses is, he says, I want this one because I would much rather be in the hands of you than of somebody else. And that's sort of Habakkuk's response here. He says, I don't like that, but at least, God, it's you who are bringing about this judgment. You're not leaving us in the hands of someone else. You're leaving us in your hands. And so it's very clear here, like other places, that even though Babylon is going to be coming in and doing, and that's who Judah is going to be dealing with, it's who's bringing it about. It's God. It's ordained. You have ordained them as judgment. So they're coming because God directed them. Verse 13, you who are of purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong, why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? So Habakkuk, he says, I understand, and I'd rather be in your hands than anybody else, but God, you are using something far, far worse than what's going on in Judah to take care of the evil in Judah. How can you do that? How can you use the evil Babylonians to destroy the evil people in Judah? It says this doesn't solve the problem that's going on here. It doesn't solve evil. In fact, it just adds to it. What are you doing? You're allowing more evil into the land. Skip down to 17. Is he then to keep on emptying his net? This is Babylon. He here is Babylon. Is Babylon to keep on emptying his net? Is he going to be allowed to continue to do this? It basically is the question here. It's a very poignant question. It's a question I would want to ask. How long are you going to let Babylon do this? You're going to let them just wipe out Judah? You're going to let them wipe out everybody else too? They're going to take over the whole earth? What's going on here, God? Then chapter 2, verse 1. I think this is interesting. He says, I will take my stand at my watchpost. This is Habakkuk speaking in the first person. I will take my stand at my watchpost, station myself on the tower, and look out to see what he will say to me and what I will answer concerning my complaint. So Habakkuk's going to take a stand. He's going to stand up, and he's going to wait for God to respond. He's interceding here, and he's wanting to know what's happening, and he's taking a stand here. He cares about his country. He cares about his community. He cares about his countrymen. He cares about those righteous few. What's interesting to me, and I think despite the bone-chilling kind of news that this would have been for Habakkuk here, and then at the very end, there's a couple of really amazing statements. And this is one of them. Despite God saying, I'm going to bring Babylon in, Habakkuk doesn't abandon his post. He says, I'm going to go and stand on the mountain. I'm going to go and watch. And I'm going to continue to be your prophet because my people need someone to go between us. And you've called me to that. I'm reading into this a little bit, but he doesn't flee for some other country with this foreknowledge of what's going to happen. He doesn't he doesn't do that. He stands firm. He stands his ground, and he doesn't run away. In fact, he maybe takes his calling even more seriously when he knows what's going to be coming their way. Chapter 2, God answers again. The Lord answered me, verse 2, write the vision, make it plain on tablets, so he may run who reads it. For still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end. It will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. So here, this is interesting. He's told to write the vision down, not just to speak it, but to write it down, probably so that it could be passed around. And he says, he who reads it, maybe they can run and escape this. So you can even see there that this isn't like a complete and total wipe Judah off the face of the earth kind of judgment. It may not come when you want it to, but it's going to come, God says. Verse 4, behold, his soul is puffed up. It is not upright within him. Chapter 1, verse 11, Babylon's described as a place whose might is their God. Their might is their God. So they're puffed up. They see themselves as God. In fact, you can see that with Nebuchadnezzar when he makes the statue of himself and makes everybody bow down to the statue. His advisors get him to do that to try to trap Daniel. And then you have this statement, but the righteous shall live by his faith. Have you seen that statement before? Somewhere besides Habakkuk? What's that? Paul? Yep. It's quoted in 3 New Testament books. 3 New Testament books. Galatians 3:11, which is Paul. Romans 1:17, and it's the thesis statement of all of Romans. The righteous shall live by faith. In Romans, it's a little interesting because you don't know whether his refers to Jesus or whether it refers to an individual person who's reading Romans, maybe. And then also in Hebrews chapter 10, 37 through 38. So this was an important passage for Paul and whoever wrote Hebrews. You come down to verses 6 through 20, and these are woes. And a woe is what again? What's that? Terror. Yep. A woe. It would be terrifying for sure. It's basically an announcement of death, right? It's your funeral before your funeral's actually there. Your funeral's being announced. So this is. So he takes up this woe now against the Chaldeans, against the Babylonians, and he says, "Woe against them too," and they're not going to stand forever. Is his response to Habakkuk. Their death is. I am foretelling their death right now, which their lifetime after they wipe out Judah is not very long. It's not very long. What is it in Daniel? Is it 70 years? Is it 70 years until the Persians come and wipe out Babylon? I think it's 70 years. Yeah. And so I mean, Babylon doesn't last very long after they wipe out Judah. So this comes to pass. God is speaking of their death. Shall not all these take up their taunt against him with scoffing and riddles for him and say, so then he lists all these different reasons that woe is pronounced on the Chaldeans, on Babylon. This is why their death is imminent, basically. There's a couple of different sections here. Verses 6 through 8. Debtors are going to take up a taunt against them. They've borrowed all kinds of money, so they've got lots of pledges and plundered a lot of nations, and the remnant of these people are going to plunder you. Verses 9 through 12 is this picture of a nation that rules completely and totally by power. Woe to him who gets evil gain for his house, to set his nest on high, to be safe from the reach of harm. You've devised shame for your house by cutting off many peoples. You forfeited your life, for the stone will cry out from the wall, and the beam from the woodwork respond. Woe to him who builds a town with blood and founds a city on iniquity. So you have this picture of a nation that rules completely and totally by power. What normally happens to nations that rule completely and totally by power? They're not happy people. Nope. They're big and powerful until what? Somebody else bigger and more powerful than them comes along. It's kind of like the school bully, right? It only lasts for so long. Couple of examples. This is maybe not the best example, but yeah, they get conquered, absolutely. But if you think of the Israelites before Egypt enslaved them, they were already pretty numerous, and Egypt enslaved them because they were getting more numerous and they were scared of them, so they forced them into slavery. They tried to rule the Israelites by power. What happened once they did that? Did the Israelites quit growing? They grew more and more and more. In fact, they reproduced numerously, Scripture says. They made a lot of babies, which in large groups of people who are enslaved or ruled by power is actually like a scientific phenomenon or a historical phenomenon. They make tons of babies for whatever reason. It's not just Israel. It's any nation that has been oppressed like people make a lot of babies. Which you'd think, Israelites, they're out making bricks all day long. They're tired. They're worn out. I just said that on the internet. They make babies. That's what they do. And of course, eventually it's God who leads the Israelites out. But time and time and time again, people who are oppressed, they end up becoming more numerous than the people who are oppressing them. And someday they figure out that they are more numerous than the people who have power over them, and it's done. A more recent example is South Africa and apartheid, and like Nelson Mandela. You all know there's been a couple movies about some of that somewhat recently. But the oppressed people in South Africa, they grew way more numerous than the people who were in power, and eventually the people who were in power, they went by the wayside because the oppressed people realized they were more numerous. So you can only rule by power for so long, because somebody who's bigger and more powerful than you is going to come along, and all you do is create unrest among everybody. So it doesn't work. So and here, woe to him who builds a town with blood and founds a city on iniquity. You brought about your own death, Babylon. 15 through 16, just want to point this out. Woe to him who makes his neighbors drink. You pour out your wrath and make them drunk in order to gaze at their nakedness. So fast forward a whole bunch of years to Revelation, and you have the whole bowls that are being poured out, the 7 bowls in Revelation. This is a common image in some prophetic works, is God's wrath being poured out from like a cup or from a bowl. It's like it's a whole bunch of liquid, and he's pouring out his wrath on particular peoples and nations. So he's not literally pouring it out of a cup, probably, but that's just one of those very visual images of God pouring out his wrath. 18 through 20, what profit is an idol when its maker has shaped it, a metal image, a teacher of lies, for its maker trusts in its own creation when he makes speechless idols. Woe to him who says to a wooden thing, awake, to a silent stone, arise, can this teach? Behold, it's overlaid with gold and silver. There's no breath at all in it, but the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. God's temple is different. It's different than the worthless idols that you are bowing down to, that Babylon is bowing down to. The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silent before him, which is probably a little bit of a knock on these statues that are silent. Chapter 3, this is a prayer and a song. You see in verse 3 and verse 9 and verse 13, out to the side, at least in my translation, there's a word there. What's that word? You'll see it. Maybe it's not in the margin. Maybe it's like heading those verses. Selah, S-E-L-A-H, Selah, probably how it was said. Y'all see that? So it's actually part of the text. And maybe if you've got a different translation, it's omitted it somewhere. But it's actually some kind of musical term. S-E-L-A-H. You see it in the Psalms a lot. It's a musical term. And it was, we don't really know exactly what it means now, but it gave some sort of direction for how a song was supposed to be sung. Lots of Israel's worship, you'll see the word Selah or Selah in it. And then at the very end, chapter 3 ends with this, to the choir master with stringed instruments. So chapter 3 is a prayer that was meant to be sung to instruments. O Lord, I've heard the report of you and your work, O Lord, do I fear. In the midst of the years, revive it. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. His splendor covered the heavens. The earth was full of its praise. His brightness was like the light. So this was a song that they sang. Probably something that the righteous people he spoke of in the beginning would pray or sing, and it at some point had some music to it. And it's mostly about God coming to deal with evil. Verse 16, I hear and my body trembles, my lips quiver at the sound, rottenness enters, tremble beneath me. Yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon people who invade us. Who are the people who are coming to invade them? Babylon, the Chaldeans. So it's a song about God delivering them from that evil eventually, even though they know it's coming. Let's see. Love how it ends, 17 through 19. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food. So even though everything's going to totally fall apart, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on high places. Everything's laid waste. And yet, Habakkuk says, I will rejoice in the Lord. And that's how Habakkuk ends there. Makes me think of what's the song that we sing? Blessed be the Lord. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be his name. That talks about praising him in good times and in bad times. And Habakkuk's certainly an example of that. Any questions about Habakkuk? All right, let's flip to Joel. Hosea, Joel, Amos. So in between Hosea and Amos. So Joel's kind of a confusing book. If you were to pick up 3 or 4 different commentaries on Joel, it is quite possible that you would think that they are each commentating on an entirely different book. It's sort of like Revelation. You can pick up a commentary or a book about Revelation and have 2 or 3 of them, and it's like they're talking about something totally different. And Joel's is a little bit like that. One of the big reasons why it's like that is that we don't really know exactly when Joel was written. We can kind of try to deduce from what he wrote, so like from some of the things that he wrote about, but it's really placed anywhere from about 600 to 400 BC. So we're not sure exactly when it was written. I'm not going to try to nail that down for you. I'm going to move through this pretty quick. So if you get a chance, go to the BibleProject.com, and they have all sorts of videos on every single book. They're good little overviews. If you've had a class with Kirk before, I'm sure you've probably watched some. The one on Joel they're all good, but the one on Joel is fabulous. It's fabulous. So if you get a chance, go watch the one about Joel. But he talks about Israel being scattered and Judah and Israel being restored. So in that respect, it kind of sounds like they've both already been destroyed, but is he talking about Judah and Israel being restored like in the future tense, or is he talking about it as if it's already happened? So, is this like the time of, who knows? And based on when you date it, it changes how you read things like the day of the Lord, like when the day of the Lord came, and it changes. It changes the whole aspect of the book, really, depending on when you date it. So, chapter 2, verses 7 and 9. It looks like it assumes that the walls are around Jerusalem. So, if those walls have already been rebuilt, who rebuilt the walls? Remember who rebuilt the walls, or who was in charge of it? Nehemiah. Nehemiah came and organized Jerusalem to rebuild the walls around it. So, if that's the case, then Joel takes place after Nehemiah. But more conservative scholars probably would say it's around the same time as Habakkuk, about the time that Babylon was about to come in. So about the same time as the book that we just finished. It's really, really hard to pin down. So let's talk about what is clear in Joel. What is clear is that there has been a very particular crisis or disaster, a locust plague, and that there's also, so it's sort of difficult also because he goes back and forth. He goes back and forth between this locust plague that has already happened, and this day of the Lord that is going to happen. So he goes back and forth between a past event and something that he's seeing coming their way in the future. And so when you're reading through it, if you're like past tense and then your future tense and your past tense and your future, that's wise. He's going back and forth between something that's already happened and something that is going to happen, something that's coming their way. So what has happened is a locust plague. I don't know if y'all grabbed this little paper here. So this is an excerpt from. Did you get one? This is an excerpt from that's about from a book, Giants. What's it called? Giants and the Earth, and it's a story about some Norwegian immigrants who settled in South Dakota. And there were 3 farmers one day, and they're sitting around talking about how good their crops are going, how good the weather's been, and they're pretty excited. So they're just kind of sitting around on the front porch talking, seemingly, and then they see this huge cloud in the distance. and within seconds, the sun is no more. It's like it's nighttime and there's no stars in this. It's like there's an eclipse. And he describes a locust plague and how absolutely devastating it is. There were some recently, somewhere in Africa, I can't remember, just 2 or 3 years ago, and I mean, a swarm of locusts can destroy an entire field of crops in about 30 seconds. 30 seconds to a minute, they can destroy an entire field of crops. So you can imagine if there's this huge locust plague that comes on Judah, probably, maybe, and this is what Joel is talking about, it would have been devastating. You see him talking about, like, we don't have any vineyards anymore, we don't have any crops anymore, we don't have this anymore, we don't have this anymore. And then when you get rid of all of that and all the dirt is around, there's no more vegetation on the dirt, then rivers change and the water supply change. I mean, it affects everything. It's absolutely devastating. So this locust plague comes on the people who Joel is talking about here. Let's see. So, Joel, he's not condemning anything. A lot of the prophets, they're like condemning certain kinds of behavior and certain kinds of things. Joel's not doing that. He quotes Isaiah and Amos and Zephaniah, so we know that it takes place after them. He's well read. He's read all Isaiah and Amos and Zephaniah. He himself probably lived near Jerusalem because he talks about, like, in depth about the temple and about Mount Zion, about Judah, about Jerusalem. When he talks about suffering, he doesn't say your suffering. He says our suffering. So Joel's in the middle of this with everybody else. So, we don't know much, just that there was this invasion of locusts that has come. So in chapter 1, verses 2 and 3, he gives some instructions. He says, "Hear this, you elders, give ear, all inhabitants of the land. Has such a thing happened in your days or in the days of your fathers? Tell your children of it. Let your children tell their children, and let their children and their children to another generation." So why would they do that? Why would they want to tell about this event to children? Why would this event want to be passed down? Why do you do that? This is something unprecedented. That's a word that's been tossed around a little bit recently, right? Unprecedented. This was an unprecedented event. He says, has such a thing happened in your days or even in the days of your fathers? This was unprecedented for them. And he says, tell your children about it. This is something worth telling your children about. If you continue reading, you see that they're delivered from this plague because they fast, they pray, they seek God, and he delivers them. They give the credit to them being delivered from this plague of locusts, from their lives being utterly destroyed. They give God the credit for delivering them from it. So I would think about, you think the Israelites told their children about the parting of the Red Sea? Maybe, maybe not. Hopefully they did, because that's a pretty miraculous thing, right? Now, they did see a lot of miraculous things during that period of time when Moses was leading them out of Egypt. But they grumble and they complain and they make golden calves and they do all sorts of other things. So they wander around in the desert for years and years and years until basically that entire generation that was actually in Egypt, like the adults, they're gone. So there's a new generation by the time that they're about to come into the promised land. And you remember Moses dies, he's not allowed to enter the promised land, and so Joshua, he takes over. And they're camped on one side of the Jordan River, and in order to get into the promised land, they have to get across the Jordan River. So I think maybe they did tell him, because here's what happens. God tells Joshua, get the priests, line up with the Ark of the Covenant, and have everybody get in line behind you, behind the priests. I mean, we're talking 600,000 people. If it's 600,000 men, and then everybody else, we're talking like 1 million plus people. If it's 600,000, I mean, either way, that's a whole lot of people. All of those people get up and they line up expectantly in front of the Jordan River that something's going to happen and they're going to make it into the promised land that day. The Jordan River is at flood stage. You ever seen a river at flood stage? You ever seen bayous at flood stage? Like the little bayou over here? It goes from about this deep to way over this ceiling, like that, if it's raining really hard. And that is a scary, scary, scary thing. That's like if you're in that water, you're fixing to die. There's like bundles of snakes, because the snakes all grab onto each other. And then there's bundles of fire ants. You seen that? All the fire ants, they grab onto each other and they flood. You don't want to be in that water. And here is 600,000 plus people who line up expecting that they're going to make it across the river that day. And what happens? They start walking, the priests get knee deep in the water with the ark, and it parts. Again, the same thing happens again. They walk through the middle, all the people get across, and God has them send 12 people, one from each tribe, back into the middle of the river and pick up what? Stones. They're stones of what? Remembrance. They're stones of remembrance. They're Ebenezers. You know that song? Here I lay my Ebenezer. What's that? Yeah, each tribe got one stone. And it was so that they would remember that day and what God had done for them. I think it's interesting that you have basically the exact same event happen with one generation, and then the exact same event happens with the next generation. Why do you think God did that? I think it's because this new generation needed to see God work powerfully in their lives like he had worked in the generation of people before them. They needed to see it. And God knew that. And then he gives them these stones so that they could remember and pass on that event and the way that God acted in mighty ways in that day, so they could pass it on from generation to generation to generation to generation to generation, because the next generation needs to know that God is mighty and powerful, and it can and will act on behalf of his people. So that's sort of the whole point of Joel. We're told the whole point right here. Tell your children of it, let your children tell their children, and their children to another generation. There was this terrible thing that happened. We prayed, we fasted, we sought God in the middle of this terrible locust plague that happened when our lives were utterly ruined, and he delivered it from us, delivered us from it. Let me tell you, people, there is a day of the Lord coming. His judgment is coming. And it's going to be another day of being totally and utterly ruined like this day was. And we need to remember that when we sought God, when we humbled ourselves, when we fasted, when we prayed, when we did all of those things, God delivered us from that day. So when the day of the Lord comes in the future, We need to remember this day so that we can remember to fast and pray and humble ourselves and do the same things in that day. Because God doesn't change, and if he acted that way in the Locust Plague, that he's going to act that way in this future day of the Lord also. So tell your children so that they know what to do when trouble comes their way. It's the same kind of thing. And that's Joel in a nutshell, is we've got to remember this. We've got to remember that God delivered us from this so that when this future day of trouble comes, we're ready for it and we respond in the same way so that God will deliver us then too. So remember it. Tell your children. Let your children tell their children and their children to another generation. One thing I want to point out really quick, because it's kind of becomes an important verse in the New Testament. Chapter 2, verses 28 and 29. And it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, your old men shall dream dreams, and your young men shall see visions. Even on the male and female servants in those days I will pour out my Spirit. Where do we see that in the New Testament? Oh, you know. One of the disciples says it. Close. They're in the courtyards, beginning of Acts, and they're in the temple courtyards, and everybody starts speaking in all these different languages. Tongues of fire fall. What's that? Peter. Yeah. He says, no, we're not drunk. Let me tell you what's happening today. Remember what Joel said? That's what's happening today. The Spirit of God has been poured out on all of us. So we see this come to pass in Acts chapter 2, when God's Spirit is poured out on believers in Jesus. And that is Joel in a nutshell. And I didn't really leave us enough time to be able to talk about the assignment. Real quick. So, writing assignment. Students will choose one of the 14 books we're studying this semester and write the following. 1 is a summary of the historical context into which the prophet spoke and for which his words were compiled. So, if I'm going to say that in different words, what was going on during the time that Amos wrote? What was going on in Israel that, who was king? What was going on? What had that king done? Things were really good in Israel during that time. It was a time of everybody laying around. The rich were rich, the poor were poor. And the rich were taking it to the poor. And they were being lazy. They were, right, like all those things are going on in Amos, right? So that's the historical context into which a prophet spoke. Number 2, a description of 2 main ideas that the prophet spoke about that are always relevant. So there's lots of things we read here, and some of them sound kind of weird, but what I want us to come away with is not just like one specific verse, but what is like a main idea of this book? Like in Amos, the treatment of those who don't have very much is incredibly important to Amos. And that is a truth that is consistent with all of Scripture. God cares deeply about the oppressed. And he cares deeply about how they're treated. And he cares deeply about how nations do justice, not based on how much somebody, that's a main idea from Amos that is going to stand until Jesus comes back, right? That's a main idea that we can come away from Amos with, the treatment of those who don't have much. So that would be an example of a main idea that's always relevant. Then number 3, write 2 sermons or lesson briefs involving those 2 main ideas. So take the 2 main ideas from that book and write out 2 different lessons, basically. It can be an outline, it can be actually written out, but give me a sermon or a lesson that is based on those 2 main ideas, that includes a description of who you're speaking to, your audience. Like, okay, I'm going to teach this to well, like if you're teaching to a college class, it's going to be different than if you're teaching a bunch of teenagers, right? Who's your audience? What's your audience like? What's your like my audience when I preach here at Impact? It's incredibly diverse. Got people from every walk of life I can possibly imagine. And so when I preach a sermon at Impact, I have to think very, very deeply about who is going to be hearing it, and make sure that in some way, shape, or form, I touch everybody in the congregation that day. And that's a difficult thing because some places it's a little easier to think about. Other places it's pretty difficult. Here, it's difficult to try to come up with a lesson that touches everybody in some way, shape, or form, right? So think about your audience. Think about your audience. I want a key scripture. So make sure I get like a key scripture. If it's from one of these, you probably should have a key scripture from one of the books whatever book you're doing this out of. But if there's another key scripture, include that too. A thesis statement. I don't know what a thesis statement is. Like, what's the main point? What is the main point? Give me a sentence about the main point of what you're talking about. I've heard over and over and over again, if your sermon has more than one point, it doesn't have any points at all. I heard that in like 3 different preaching classes. Obviously, sermons have more than one point, but most sermons have like one overarching main thing that you're trying to get across. If you try to include too much in a lesson or in a sermon, then everybody just comes away scattered. So what's the main point? What's your thesis statement? And then give me an outline of your sermon or lesson. Questions? This is sort of the process that I go through every time I do a lesson or a sermon. So I mean, if you'd rather just write out what you would say, that's fine. When I say outline, like Roman numeral 1, Roman numeral 2, Roman numeral 3, Roman numeral 4, introduction, conclusion, done. 3 points, A, B. So something like that. But if there's another way that you'd rather do it, that's fine too. Yeah, just one sentence that describes whatever your main point is. What you're wanting everybody to hear. Like if you try to boil your whole sermon down into one sentence, your one lesson down into one sentence. Yeah, exactly. Yes. Yeah. Like if you were going to write an essay for an English class, right? Usually at the end of the first paragraph, you have your thesis statement. And then at the very end, you restate that thesis statement in a different way. And then everything that's in between there contributes to this thesis statement or this main point that you're trying to make. So a sort of a similar idea. You have this one main point, and then everything else hopefully contributes to that main point somehow, some way in your lesson. All right, ready, break? Yep.